I'm Len.
I'm Vanessa.
And I'm Jonas.
We're from Troy, North Carolina.
And this is Oxford in America.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Oxford in America. We're about 17 days into our journey, and we've covered about 2,200 miles and have reached our sixth state, Colorado. Now, Colorado is the home of the Rocky Mountains, and that makes the theme of this episode, elevation. We basically started our journey at sea level on the west coast of America. From there, we quickly climbed up the Cascades Mountain Range to cover Crater Lake, Reno, Lake Tahoe, and our highest peak so far at Monitor Pass, California, at an impressive 8,000 feet in elevation. After that, we dipped back down into the desert of Barstow and Las Vegas, but then began climbing back up again through the Grand Canyon in Moab, Utah. And all of that is an impressive accomplishment for a Land Rover that's 65 years old and has a 52 horsepower motor that's running sort of okay. But our biggest challenge lies ahead with our plan to scramble up an additional 7,000 feet in elevation with the goal of making our highest peak of, as near as makes no difference, 13,000 feet.
We set up our Colorado base in Ridgeway at the home of Mike and Cindy Boggs. They acted as a sort of tour guide and showed us some of the 20th century marvels of this part of the country, including the first alternating current electricity station, as well as the modern ghost town of Uravan, made famous due to its uranium mining. While the town closed up in 1984, you can still see the remnants of the mining activity today. But what this area is most famous for is the gold and silver mines of the late 19th century. The mountains are filled with the remains of old mine shafts, rail car tracks, and other mining infrastructure.
But all of this sightseeing wasn't getting us to our elevation goals. So we turned Oxford's nose uphill and started our climb up Uray's $1 million highway.
The highway is rumored to have received its nickname due to the $1 million price tag to build the road, a seemingly impossible sum of money in the 1920s. I'm not sure if that story is true, but what I can tell you is that the views are priceless. When we reached the top, we achieved our first pass at a modest 11,000 feet, or about 3,300 meters in Euro speed. As exciting as that was, there was no time to rest as we continued to climb. And continued to climb. Until we reached our second goal of Ophir Pass at 11,800 feet. Now, Ophir is officially part of the Trans-American Trail, and this gave us another opportunity for Mike to face his fear of heights and navigate this thin ribbon of road carved into the edge of the mountain. It wasn't long before we reached our next highest pass of 12,650 feet. From there, the team gained another 100 feet and reached our next objective of crossing over Hurricane Pass at 12,730 feet.
Climbing to these passes, these extreme altitudes, Oxford was running lower on powder, but steeper on incline.
Yes.
And the two weren't working well together.
And rugged terrain, and we're climbing over some rocks here and there, and it was a challenge in a lot of places.
Yeah, I remember one of the moments of the trip that stuck with me and Mike afterwards was how Mike and I and Oxford all worked together as a unit to make this happen. And there's one point climbing up Hurricane Pass where we're climbing steeper and steeper, lower on power, and we kept coming into these rocks and these holes, and we got to a point where Oxford was in a hole at a high altitude and it just simply wouldn't climb out of this small hole. So naturally, I told Mike to get out.
Yeah, again, I'm bailing out and push Oxford. We could see the summit. I mean, it was just, 100 yards maybe at the most?
Yeah.
And we hit a little dip, and Oxford just didn't want to come out of the dip.
So I took some dead weight out of the truck, pitched it outside, and then Mike put his shoulder into it and pushed Oxford out of the hole while I was driving it. And together, the three of us climbed that mountain, and that was like the trip.
It was
three of us
amazing.
working together.
Yep.
Even though it was a struggle, Oxford made it. We all made it. To the highest point of Oxford's North American adventure, 12,960 feet. Traveling at these heights, it was easy to see the effects of altitude, not just with our lunch, but with Oxford too. And that brings us to this episode's Oxford Repair Moment.
With today's modern cars, drivers have grown to expect certain modern conveniences. Things like this,
Starting route to the White House.
or even this. But what about this? What is this? This is a radiator expansion tank. And what does this humble piece of equipment do? I'll tell you. The coolant contained in the radiator reacts much the same as everything else in the universe. When it gets hot, it expands. When it gets cool, it contracts. Now, this clever little contraption provides some place for the coolant to expand to. When the engine gets hot, the coolant moves from the radiator into the expansion tank. And when the engine cools down, the coolant then returns from the expansion tank back into the radiator. Now, most people can't remember driving a car that didn't have an expansion tank fitted. But then again, most people don't drive cars as old as Oxford. In the place of the expansion tank, Oxford was fitted with a simple overflow tube. If Oxford got too hot, the coolant just leaked out onto the ground. When Oxford cooled down, well, now it was just a little low on coolant. We didn't realize all of this at first. When we first started off with Oxford, we were traveling at near sea level, not driving that hard, and everything was rather normal. As we drove on, we began to notice that Oxford would occasionally belch out coolant after a hard climb, or it's just a little shy of when we filled it up in the morning. As we got into Colorado, we were really pushing Oxford hard, and we're steady climbing in elevation. And we should all have an idea of what that means. We began to notice that every time we stopped, Oxford had a small puddle of coolant underneath of it. Initially, Mike and I saw this as some dark omen of major engine repairs. An engine that's consuming or leaking coolant often means head gaskets or worse. However, after much poking around, we realized Oxford didn't have an expansion tank fitted, and it was behaving perfectly normal for a 65-year-old Land Rover. So now we're done with the Rockies, and it's all downhill from there, literally. Our next stop is some sand dunes. And you may ask yourself, sand dunes in the center of the United States? Well, check this out.
These dunes were formed by winds picking up sand particles from ancient dried up lake beds. These winds were blocked by the Sangre de Cristo mountain range, and then the sand accumulated at the base of the mountains. The dunes cover an area of over 30 square miles and contain the highest sand dunes in North America, coming in at about 750 feet. We stopped off at the visitor center and then took a quick tour of the park. From there, we aired down the tires and started to explore the sandy road to Medano Pass. On the way to the top of the pass, we decided to let Bob Steele and Lawrence Michelin take a turn at the wheel of Oxford. I also think Mike wanted a turn at driving Bob's new Defender, but we won't get into that here.
Mike and David were kind enough to say, hey Larry, would you like to drive Oxford? Of course, I jumped at the chance, and I'll say that I was a little bit nervous because I'm like, I don't want to break it. So we were going through these tracks. It was just enjoyable. I could have been on a flat, paved road and had fun in Oxford. But this was a little bit challenging, and we started going uphill, and there were some cross-axled sections in the sand. So I didn't want to push Oxford too hard. So I kind of took it easy, and sure enough, got cross-axled and got stuck. So, David jumps out and goes, I got this. And I'm like, okay. And he got to the front of the truck and he kind of just leaned on it and kind of pushed me backwards. And at the same time, the sand spun out, and I think David got a little bit of sand in his shorts. I did not overstay my welcome. I was more than happy to turn it back over. I had my chance, and I thank David and Mike for everything they did to bring that to fruition.
At the end of the dunes and through Medano Pass, we parted ways with our friends Mike, Lawrence, and Bob. But not before we stopped at one of the most eclectic roadside coffee stands we'd ever seen, and while we lined up to pose for a photo that Lawrence has been begging for since he joined the expedition, the old red, white, and blue.
Well, that does it for this episode of Oxford in America. Join us next time when we meet up with some new friends and explore the Great Plains of Oklahoma.